I'm Robert Sturm. Many of you have communicated with me through this registration process. Really glad to see everyone here. I'd like to just take a couple minutes before we get started to first thank all of our sponsors, including the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office of UNM Hospital and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office of the Health Sciences Center here at UNM, and Community Medicine at Presbyterian, and the Envision Fund at the Santa Fe Community Foundation, the Scholars Strategy Network, Southwest Care Center, and whoever else I've forgotten. Look at our sign on the way out, or look at it, and you'll see all the list of logos. We are excited to be here and excited that on Tuesday nothing changed in New Mexico in a dramatic way that will make this work unlikely to continue. We are going to talk a lot today about stuff that's happening here in New Mexico, particularly things happening with the state. And I'm excited that I feel really clear that that work is going to continue over the next several years, and the progress we've made will get built on rather than eroded. Realize you are making a political statement by being here today. The fact that we are here doing this work is in and of itself a political statement. For the good, right? It's a good thing. I'm not a particularly political person, but I've recognized that those of us who just do this work on a daily basis, we are in fact making political statements. And when things go not the way we'd like in elections or in leadership at the state and federal government, at least we can continue our work towards the direction that we want to see our society go. So thanks for being here with us to do that. Know that this is meant to be a very much a participatory event. So throughout all the presentations, ask questions if you have questions, give comments if you have comments. After the event is over, if you have comments or suggestions for future events, please let me know. You're welcome to grab me here today to talk during breaks and so on. You're also welcome to email me afterwards using the email from your registration, right, for this event. We really want to make sure that this event is based in community interest, community values, that we're talking about topics that matter to you. Last thing I'll let Fabian do it, and then I'll go.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Fabian Armijo. I'm one of the executive directors at UNM Hospital. I oversee diversity, equity, and inclusion, which includes, we have our educator here from the department, Maria Bustamante. So we organize a lot of trainings, a lot of trainings for our staff, our workforce. So she helps do all of that work. She works with Transgender Resource Center to create a class for trans awareness in our hospital, and a bunch of other classes, including, caring for the deaf community. And we bring in people from the Commission for the Deaf who provide training. The whole training is taught in ASL. So everybody, like all the hearing people, get to experience what it's like for a second to not be able to access the information directly, right? It's a really powerful class. So we do that. It also includes Native American Health Services. I oversee that department. Interpreter language services, and also community engagement. So later on today, you'll get to meet with that team, and we'll have a kind of a listening session. And we'd really like if you can participate in that to stick around for that. All of the information and feedback that we gather today and during that session, we'll put into the hospital strategic plan and our community health needs assessment. So it's a way of kind of holding the hospital accountable. So you'll bring things up and we can talk about, we'll have to categorize things into 3 buckets. What are systemic things that we probably can't change right away, but we can work on? What are things that are directly related to the hospital, which are things that a lot of times are in our control? One thing that came out of that a long time ago was updating our electronic health record to include sexual orientation, gender identity, preferred name. All those things were from community input. So, I'm really happy that you're here today. It's great to see all of your beautiful faces so early on a Saturday morning. And we're excited that you're here and we want to learn from you. And events like this really make UNM Hospital better. So thank you for being here. We're not perfect, but I think a lot of times we can learn and start to change things. Even if it takes a while, but we want to work on it and we're dedicated to that. Thank you, Robert, for letting us be a part of this. And yeah, we'll be around. So thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Bayo. So just a few notes about presentations and order today. No big surprise in the time of almost post-COVID, I want to believe, that we have some changes to our agenda and our presenters today. So the first presentation will be as listed on your agendas. We're going to talk about the new 988 behavioral health crisis response system, which went live in July. And we're going to talk about where we are, what's coming, what it means to our communities in particular, right? Why is this particularly relevant to LGBTQ communities? And how can we make sure as the system is built out that it really works for our community as well? Then we will do an update on SOGI data collection, sexual orientation and gender identity data collection at the state of New Mexico. Same presenters as planned. That part, so far, so good. After that first break, however, things already start to shift. We will still have our update on policy post-Roe, but it will all be done by Mr. Marshall Martinez without the help of his partner in crime, who unfortunately tested positive for COVID yesterday. But nonetheless, the content will remain the same. We will hear what's happening in New Mexico and around the country in this post-Roe period, what we're expecting, what we're watching, what we're trying to avoid, what we need to be really attentive to, right? We will also have an update at that point on what's happening, some efforts here at UNM in the hospital and the Health Sciences Center to improve things for LGBTQ folks. And we're expecting to be joined online via Zoom with someone from the Navajo Nation to talk about some updates that are on things that are happening there for LGBTQ folks. After the break, after that session is when things get dramatically different. Victor Hernandez, who is going to present today on immigration policy and how immigration policy is affecting LGBTQ folks, was unfortunately called out of town. A couple of people in his family are dramatically ill, and he had to leave to be with his family as they await potentially the end of some lives. And because this did not get really dramatic until yesterday, there was no time. We did our best to scramble to try to get a replacement, but we're not able. So that session is not going to happen this year. We're going to try to get Victor back next year if that's something folks are interested in. It's not that we've lost, that we don't want to talk about that, but we want someone who can do it really well. So instead, what we're going to do for that last session before lunch is we're going to move up the listening session that UNM had planned for the afternoon, give you a chance to really tell them what would make things work better in the hospital, for all of us to really participate, hopefully, in thinking about that. And then we'll have lunch and then you can go home. So there you go. It's not a terrible thing, but just so you know what's coming, that's where we are. Any questions or comments before I dive into this first presentation? Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. So let's talk about 988. How many of you have heard about 988? Good. How many of those of you who've heard of it know what it is? Okay, we're doing well. How many of you still have questions? Okay. Cool. Then I'm not gonna waste your time. I will do my best to answer all questions. And if there aren't answers, one of the good things, when we took this contract, my organization actually has a contract to do this work, both training professionals who are going to work in the 988 system on how to work with LGBTQ folks, but also talking to the LGBTQ communities around the state of New Mexico about this system. And one of the things that I don't want to say demanded, but that we wrote into our contract, let's put it that way, it sounds nicer, was that we would not just share information from the state with the community, but that we expected to listen to the community each time we did that, get input from folks in the community that come to these presentations about your concerns, your fears, et cetera, in accessing 988, as well as your suggestions for how the system can best respond to the needs of our community. So know that you can certainly ask questions throughout, but then at the end of this, I would also really encourage you guys to tell me of any concerns you have that you'd like the state to know about. Because I work directly with both the training coordinator and the actual coordinator of the whole 988 program. And part of my job is to bring back to them what folks in the community are concerned about in a way that doesn't get tied to anybody's name or even a particular location. So you don't have to feel at all uncomfortable saying whatever it is you want to say, because they really want to know, what are they doing right? What haven't they thought of? What are your concerns that they should keep in mind as we move forward? Because they really are dedicated to making sure that the system really does work for our community in a way that a lot of other systems do not. So I love how that T decides to drop to the third line. These are not my slides. I did not make these slides. They're very pretty. They were made by Cerna Solutions in Santa Fe, who had the contract to do the basic intro for the system for the state. So yeah, just to acknowledge that we are on land that has been used for a very long time by a lot of different indigenous folks. Right? What is 988, right? So you guys mostly know, it sounds like, so I won't take a lot of time on this, but what we all know is 911 as an emergency system has been around for quite a while in this country, right? And part of the problem with 911 historically has been that it's meant to respond to all kinds of crises. And the people that respond are often law enforcement folks and or fire department first responders who are trained for certain kinds of emergencies, but not necessarily for all of the things that people really need help with. And one of the areas in which they themselves will tell you that they're not very good is behavioral health crises, right? If someone is freaking out because they've run out of their meds or they forgot to take their meds, or because something really, really bad happened and they're feeling suicidal that day, two cops in a car with a siren may not be who that person most needs to respond to them, right? So 988 is designed in response to that, to an understanding of that need and that mismatch, right? And the idea is lots and lots of the crises that happen are related to either substance use or mental illness. And wouldn't it be better if they were responded to by people who are trained to work with that, right? So the 988 system says the idea is that folks having those kinds of crises, rather than calling 911 and potentially having someone come that really has no idea how to help them, they go directly to 988, where the staff answering the phone are trained behavioral health providers, right? And they're trained to listen to what's going on, to ask appropriate questions, to provide appropriate support, to potentially make referrals and so on, right? So the idea is to pull all of these behavioral health issues out of the 911 system, out of the law enforcement response system, at least for the first analysis, right? If someone is physically at risk or putting someone else physically at risk, where we go later, we'll talk about. But the idea is just to acknowledge that most of the time, it would be better for someone in a behavioral health crisis to talk to a behavioral health provider. Okay. The system went live officially, the phone lines, on July 16th, right? It's so interesting. Each system does this differently. My slides have never done that L on its own line before. No, it's okay to say. I'm just noticing how technology, right? So reasons that one might call the 988 line would be anything having to do with substance use of any kind, right? So maybe someone is ODing or you think they are in the next room, or you think you are. Maybe you've been not using for some period of time and you're feeling like maybe something bad enough has happened today that you're at risk of using again, and there's no one else for you to talk to. If you're in a 12-step system, maybe your sponsor is not accessible. Whatever's going on, do you need someone to help you because you don't want to use, right? So it could be anything like that. It could be someone you decide, oh, I'm really ready for treatment. Like I'm ready for detox, doc detox right now. What do I do? If I wait till tomorrow, I might not do it anymore, right? Any of those things could be substance-related kinds of calls. Also could be someone just feeling suicidal and really wanting help figuring out what sort of support they can get, or feeling super depressed and just needing some help, or anxious. Right? Any other, someone who's been on meds for mental health issues and realizes they've run out and they're really afraid that if they don't get their meds refilled really quickly, they're going to be in crisis. Right? All kinds of things like that. And you can call 988 both for yourself and or for someone else that you care about, that you see potentially at risk. Okay. I'm not going to read any of these. I think this is sort of self-explanatory, right? We know the things that bring folks to behavioral health crises, almost any aspect of life, right? Depending on how we take it in that moment, it's kind of fragile. We are fragile. Yeah, right. So as I said, as we started, we're all pretty clear that current first responders are not the right folks to respond to this. That's why we want to do this. The goal is now that we will have 911 and 988 as parallel systems. They will interact with each other. They'll be able to do direct transfers, right? So if someone calls 911 and what they describe is appropriate for 988, the 911 operator can forward them to 988 and vice versa. Right? So it's not meant to be siloed. The goal is just to have the right person respond to each crisis. The other thing about, there's another one, responsibility. The other thing about 988 is, guess what? It's cheaper. It's way, way cheaper to take care of people's crises by having them talk to someone who knows what to say and what to ask and what to offer them than it is to send 2 or 3 people in a cop car or in an ambulance or whatever else when that isn't even what they need. Right. So not only do we get better response, but it also costs significantly less, which should allow us to use our resources better and have fewer folks go through crises without appropriate response. So there you go. How will 911 and 988 interact? So this is a really cute little model. So starting way at the left, right, we go left to right. If someone calls 988, then pilot projects in other states have shown that about 80% of the folks who engage the system get what they need from that first call. Because they're talking to someone that's trained to help them through what's going on, most of the time that's enough to at least get them through to the next day. Right, gets them to the point where they're not going to do anything dangerous to themselves or anyone else, where they can go to sleep and they have a plan, right, for the next day, whether it's they've been referred somewhere or they've been given an idea of what their next step might be, right? So 80% of folks get what they need on the phone and we're done. Of the next step for folks who find that that is not sufficient in the system as envisioned, right? This is not in place yet, but this is what's coming, let's be clear. Right, the phone line is there. Everything else is slowly going to be built out over 5 years, 10 years, we'll see. 911 took 10 years, right? So no reason to think this will be faster. But the plan is to have mobile crisis teams at locations around the state of New Mexico. The goal is for there to be a team within an hour and a half of everybody in the state. As you'll see as we go further through our slides, there are some parts of the state, New Mexico, right? There's some parts of the state where that just may not be practical, but as close as possible, the idea would be for there to be a team available on call 24 hours a day within 90 minutes of everybody. And so if the person who takes the call says, okay, we can't resolve this, you need someone to come see you, and if the person is willing to provide their location, then the emergency response team, which would be at least 2 people in a special vehicle, would be called and they would go off to see this person and figure out what next steps are. Maybe they just need to sit with someone and be physically present and provide some more support, or maybe not, right? So about 70%, and again, in these pilot projects in other states, about 70% of those who needed the emergency response team found their emergency response team themselves to be sufficient to get them through what was going on. The next step when that doesn't happen would be for the emergency response team to actually take that person and bring them somewhere safe, bring them somewhere where there's more support. And what we're creating is a bunch of crisis response centers, triage centers around the state. And again, the goal would be that no one would ever be more than about 90 minutes away from one if the world worked ideally, so that we can get folks out if being where they are is dangerous, right? Maybe being at home is not safe. They need to be in a more supervised setting. Maybe there's someone else in their home that's not safe for them to be around. They need to be helped, right? So the goal is get them out and then figure out what comes next. Even if we don't know where they're going tomorrow, let's at least get them out of that situation right now. And then for those for whom just getting them out isn't enough, sometimes just getting someone away for the night might be it. Like the crisis sort of calms down and they're ready to deal with it. But if not, then from that point we can find them a detox. We can find them inpatient treatment. We can find them whatever they need. We hope. Right, that's the goal. And get them stabilized in their communities or wherever necessary. The line on the bottom just shows that if someone calls 911, either not knowing about 988 or not remembering it or whatever, they can get referred to 988 if that's appropriate. And if it's appropriate, then 911 can instead send an ambulance or police or whatever. System makes sense so far? Clear? Who can call 988 and how can they do it? So again, anyone, there's no limitations, right? You don't have to be a citizen or be a whatever. You just have to be a human, ideally. I'm sure we'll have bots contacting 988 too, but that's not the ideal. You can do it for yourself. You can do it for someone else. You can do it through voice, text, or chat, right? And at this point, right now, today, about 80% of calls made in the state with New Mexico telephones. We're going to talk about that in a second, but 80% of calls made from New Mexico telephones will go to the New Mexico Crisis and Access Line, which is our existing crisis line here in the state, right? And the other 20% that don't go to our line are mostly going there because of who the people are making the calls. So there's a special national crisis line for veterans, and so veterans might get routed there. There's also there are 3 special centers with Spanish-speaking respondents, and so if someone needs to speak Spanish, they will get referred to one of those places, or they may at this point. Right? We also have folks at the New Mexico line who are fluent in Spanish, but it just depends on where they call and what the system's looking like at that moment. There you go. And of course, sometimes it could happen that if our systems were overloaded at a particular moment and calls came through, then they would also get routed outside the state, just because all the different systems are connected in order to make sure that someone doesn't get no response. Languages. So for now, English and Spanish will be available to folks making phone calls, voice calls. Text and chat are currently only available in English. Folks who make phone calls who speak other languages, there will not be folks in the call centers who speak those other languages, perhaps, but there is access to online translation for many, many, many languages. And we're hoping to expand the languages available locally over time. I've probably said this 6 times already, so I will not say it again. I didn't create the slides. Whether you call, text, or try to use the chat function, basically the same thing happens. You get someone on the other end who is trained to respond to your need. With the chat, as with other kinds of customer service systems, if there's no one available to chat with you at the moment, you'll get a little message saying you're number 7 on the queue. Your expected wait time is X number, right? There you go. What about privacy, and how are we going to keep people's privacy, and also how's this all going to work? So unlike 911, which actually uses geolocation of your phone to track where you are physically, the 988 system for now will not. It will simply look at your phone number and it will assume that you are more or less in the place that your number originates from. But if you've moved and you've kept your number, it will think you are wherever your number is. We are going to ask folks for some basic information if they're willing to give it, right? It's optional. And that data is really just for us to be able to track who's calling this line, where are they calling from, why are they calling, so that we can plan to build out the system as effectively as possible. But anyone who chooses not to provide personal information will still get the same services, right? It's not a required thing. The only time we're really going to ask folks specifically where they are is if the conversation gets to a point where it's clear that a conversation on the phone is not sufficient. and the person needs additional help and we want to send someone there, then obviously we're going to ask them where they are so that we know where to send. Does that make sense?
Yeah. We have a quick question from somebody participating online. Their name is Newt. And they're mentioning a statement first and then asking a question. One aspect we are troubleshooting at work is how to get an LGBTQIA plus person a LGBTQIA plus identifying peer or counselor when that is desired. Part of facilitating that is creating an atmosphere where providers are willing to identify professionally in order to create that responsibility. Would 988 callers be able to request LGBTQIA plus peers or other help?
So the answer is yes, they can request them, but whether that will be available at the site where the call has been received at that moment or not can't be promised, right? So certainly someone can say, I would love to talk to a man or a woman or whatever. And I think in any of the call centers, if there is a person who fits the caller's request that's available, there's no reason that won't be responded to. But the reality is that the goal is to have a limited number of people take sometimes a large number of calls. And the idea is get someone to them right away. So yes, but is my answer. Thanks, Newt, for the question. Yeah, Katie.
Given that we want to actually follow.
Right. So at this point, there's two things going on. There's definitely ongoing evaluation of the actual call center response and the extent to which that is meeting the goals of we're hoping 80% as it has in other places, but we don't know that for New Mexico, right? We haven't done enough calls over enough time to have good data, but we're certainly tracking that. And what we're also doing, what the state is doing is acknowledging, I mean, head of BHSD, Neil, has made it very clear that this is a vision. This is not yet a reality, and that it's going to take time. And in the meantime, we know that there's not enough of any kind of services for behavioral health in New Mexico, right? So whether people enter the system through 988 or through any other place, we have this ongoing issue of not enough detox, not enough beds, not enough whatever you want to put after that. So they're looking at, and they have money set aside to support contracts around the state to build out the system. But what's happening now is slowly folks are starting to respond to the RFAs and request those funds. And then the state has to work with them to share what that needs to look like, what the expectations are, what the monitoring expectations are, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not going to be quick, is unfortunately the response. But the good thing is that if in fact we get a similar response that 80% of callers get what they need on that call, we're already light years ahead of where we were pre-988. But no, that other 20% is going to take a lot of time. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
They were asking if you could repeat the question that was asked.
Sure, absolutely. Sorry about that, folks. So the question that I just answered was actually, so where are we really now? Right? We're talking about this whole system, but the system mostly isn't there yet. And so how are we tracking, monitoring, assessing what's happening now since the system went live in July? And the idea is we are tracking and monitoring with the understanding that there's big holes in the system.
So my understanding is that 988 is the same thing as suicide hotline or the friendship line. So it's just an easier way for people to access that. Or I don't look up the number, it's 988. And so my concern is with the geolocation. So I utilized suicide hotline prior to 988 myself and my friend. And I am one of those folks that has had the same phone number for 20 years, and I'm not going to change it. And my problem is that in both of these scenarios, the person did not have the ability or did not know how to to route me to the person in my area or in the other person in my area. So it really was completely unhelpful. It was like, I can't get you to your resources. And the other issue is that I didn't necessarily need to go anywhere or need someone to go anywhere. And I just wanted someone to talk to. And that was not what they were prepared to do either.
Okay, so the question was, is 988 just the new version and a different phone number to the crisis hotline that's already been in existence? The answer is yes, basically, except that the whole system is now being built that way. Before it was just a hotline. The other piece was that talking about geolocation and also resources, that if you have a phone number, the person asking the question said that if you having a phone number from another location, having called the crisis line, the person who responded was not local and was not able to provide resources. And also, it was also brought up that the person calling didn't actually want to be removed or to have anything done. They just wanted someone to talk to. So the thing about 988, let's go backwards in terms of wanting someone to talk to. That is, if you do get someone in a 988 system in whatever state or wherever you come from and wherever your phone is still linked to, that is what there's the people, all the people answering that call now should be folks who are trained to talk to you, right? That's the whole point. Now, I'm not saying that it always works perfectly, but the concept is that all of the folks who are answering that line, or any line connected to the 988 system now, will be trained to field behavioral health crisis calls and to support the person through conversation, emotional support, whatever. So if that's what you needed, the vision of this system is that piece should work no matter where you are, because it isn't tied to local resources, right? And hopefully you don't get someone who, for whatever reason, has fallen through the cracks in terms of their training. I would also suspect that since July of this year, when 988 nationally went into effect, that the phone system and the ability to refer to places in other states and other parts of the country has been made much more robust and much clearer, because it's now not just a bunch of local state programs. It's a federal program that all of the states are participating in. And so that the capabilities to do those referrals directly, to know where the other offices are, to know how to do a direct contact, should be a bit more efficient. Yeah, again, I can't promise, but that's the vision.
So I understand this is kind of the baby, it's growing up a little bit very slowly. And, again, the scenarios in which I accessed the crisis line were years ago, but it really was, and I guess this might be regional, it really was like which police can I involve immediately as soon as we talk about things like suicidality, without questions of things like, do you have a plan? Do you have means? Are you alone? Are you under any influences? Is the person you're talking about, like, these kinds of questions? And, I had a friend that I really wanted someone to just stop by and see. The reason I hadn't heard from this person was because he was dead, asleep, whatever. And, he woke up to some police officers surrounding him. His family was woken up by some police officers surrounding him. And, that really is my biggest concern, because I am not telling people that 988 is a good idea, because I still don't trust that people are not going to be faced with any number of police officers. And it's never one, by the way. It's always at least two, sometimes up to 8.
Right. No, for sure. Well, and again, that is the whole point of 988, is for that not to happen. Right. And if you're saying that what happened to you happened years ago, it doesn't make it any less traumatic, and I'm not any less sorry. But this whole system didn't even exist at that point. So you're of course entitled to whatever your opinions and perspectives are, but I can tell you that the folks creating this system here in New Mexico, they can't speak to every state, right? So if you get referred to another state, I don't know what'll happen. But our goals are definitely to avoid everything you're describing, and that's why the system is being created. And that's all I can say.
Yeah, again, like, my biggest thing is that the second time I called, which was like a couple summers ago, maybe 2, it was for a friend who lives all the way on the East Coast. And I was trying to do something for him, because I can't fly or run or drive over there in any kind of timely manner. I'm on the phone with this person. Number one is routed to Jersey because that's my phone. The person is in PA, and they basically told me there was anything I could do, and I said, okay, great, my friend is dead now. Like, that's what I said, because that was one of the biggest realities in that moment, and thank God it wasn't true. So it was ultimately like, it did nothing for anyone.
Right.
Is there a way that 988 talking stick? Is there, I had a follow-up question to that, as we've been talking about geolocation, is there a way that if you're calling on behalf of someone and you're saying, I need to reach the 988 crisis hotline in Pennsylvania, can they route you just like they route back and forth to that
Yes.
crisis center?
Yes.
That's a nice feature.
Yeah.
That was my.
So basically the whole system has changed, or is in the, I shouldn't say has changed. It's in the process of change. The phone system has already, right? The connections are different now, again, now that this is a federal program. Guys, I want to get all your questions. I also want to respect time. Let me just get through a few more slides and then come back to questions if that's okay. It's not about wanting to silence anyone. I just don't want to run way over. And I do want to get to the actual queer specific part of this presentation if I can. Thank you for your tolerance of my inability to move faster. Whoops, doing the wrong thing. Yes, so the point about not using geolocation is privacy, right? We want people to call. We don't want people that don't want to self-disclose where they are and don't want someone to show up to feel like they can't call because someone's about to show up at their door, right? But again, the idea is that if you need help or you need help for someone else, there are ways to ask for that. Unfortunately, welfare checks may still end up being cops, right? That's just the nature of things, depending on where you're calling for. But in any case, the point is, yeah, they're trying to balance, right? Like giving people privacy with also having access to the resources that might work. It's never going to be perfect. I think there are always going to be calls that are not going to work. But this is where we are right now. 988 is being funded by a combination of federal and state dollars, right? We did get a grant from the federal government to start creating New Mexico's program. We're also putting New Mexico state dollars into this. Is it worth it? The projections say, as you can see, that basically the 988 system will cost about half as much to reach the same number of people, which should free up dollars to do other things in terms of building out other parts of the system, and also keep people safer by having responses from folks that are there to care for them, to help them get through rather than to traumatize them again. Right. So now, in terms of advertising, the state has just started. I've seen a billboard. I saw a commercial on TV. More's coming. What's it going to look like in New Mexico? Well, of course, it'll have hot air balloons. Right. We're going to send people in hot air balloons to get their care. Yeah. So the system is this is very much just a slightly different vision of how this all works. Right. The person in crisis who might be calling way on the left, and all the different pieces that are around the state. This is just a prettier picture of the same model. We've talked about mobile crisis teams, but I want to talk about it now a little bit. Some of the other pieces that are also coming to the system, recognizing New Mexico as a large rural state. So the triage centers that are being built out, there's one in Cruces that's actually open, and there's more coming. These are these places where folks can be taken out of their current situation if they need to get out of that situation to be safe. Some of the centers may only hold folks for 23 hours, right? One night, basically, as a way to get them out and then refer them somewhere else. Others will hold folks up to 14 days and may offer some kinds of treatment, including detox on site. Some will do both, right? Sort of each time an organization proposes to the state a contract to do one of these, they'll propose what they want. The state will decide if it's a good fit or not. Right? Then there's a few other pieces that we're adding because we know how rural and spread out the population is here. So another entry point that is being built is through hospital emergency, which are often not a good place to have behavioral health crises either, as we know, because the person doing triage is not necessarily a behavioral health professional. So what we're doing is planning to build teams of on-call behavioral health specialists tied to ERs that don't have their own full-time staff ready to do that. So that if someone shows up in the ER and the initial triage says, oh, this is a behavioral health issue, there will be someone who can be called who's in the local community, will be there in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever, quickly, and can then pick up that piece of doing an appropriate mental health assessment and figuring out what the next step is. Right. So it's not about telling them to call 988, right? Or saying go somewhere else. It's like you show up at the hospital because you're in a crisis and that's where you need to go. We want to be able to help you from there also directly. Right. And this is meant to be 24/7. Another option for places where the number of the population is so low that having a space, even a triage center within an hour and a half is probably not realistic, is that in some communities, there'll be a space that's sort of on call. It might be a hotel room. It might be a room in a nonprofit space. And there'll also be folks on call with access to that space. So that if there's a crisis with someone locally and they call 988 and there's no crisis, there's no emergency response team close, there's no triage center close, then these local people get called and the space gets pulled into use and there's a way to do something in that moment with that person. Right. So they're really trying to be creative. Again, I don't know what it's going to look like, but the motto, at least I think, is being realistic about recognizing how hard it is to do anything like this in New Mexico Blessed. So a couple of things about why this is particularly relevant for our community. First of all, based on the data we already have about LGBTQ folks in the state of New Mexico, we know that our communities use behavioral health services at higher rates. We have higher rates of issues with both substances and depression, anxiety, and suicide, right? So likelihood is that if the system works for us, it can help a lot of people in our communities. But we also know, right, that as we've already heard, that there's reasons for us not to try. These are just some stats. I'm not going to read any of them. None of them will be surprising to you. They're not new. But they're recent data from both the Youth Risk and Resiliency Survey, which is the state's health survey for teenagers, and the BRFIS, the state's health survey for adults, right? And you can just see, right, that since we have these concerns more frequently, the system is particularly relevant to us. I'm trusting you can all read graphs. You don't need any help with this. Not that fast. Sorry. The slides will be available if anyone wants them. This is all data from the Department of Health. It's all public. So we need the system, right? That's the part number one. But why would we trust the system, right? When we look at what's going on in terms of interaction with law enforcement, incarceration, all the systems that we associate with 911, right? What we know is 1 in 3 people in the country are people of color, but 2 are adults, and 2 in 3 adults in incarceration are people of color, right? 3.8% of adults across the country self-identify, and we all know these numbers are low, but it doesn't matter. Just look at the percentage, the contrast, right? 3% identify as LGBTQ, but 7.9, so again, double that percentage of folks in incarceration identify as LGBTQ. So we know that folks with marginalized identities like LGBTQ folks, people of color, et cetera, end up in the system far more often, not because we're more likely to do terrible things, right? But both because of the ways society pushes folks in these communities towards situations that are problematic, but also because of how we're treated when we show up in the system. 1 in 5 youth in our country identifies as LGBT or gender non-conforming. Language of the study, not my chosen language. But 85% of youth in juvenile justice facilities are queer youth of color, right? So this interaction between queer identities and BIPOC folks is pretty dramatic in terms of how it affects the likelihood of our being incarcerated. Why are we overrepresented? Here's a whole bunch of reasons, which I'm not going to talk about. I just want to acknowledge them, right? It's not that queer folks have something genetic that makes us do bad things. Just like we also don't have something genetic that makes us depressed or anxious or suicidal, right? It's about our experience in the world. And the same is true for people of color and other folks with other marginalized identities. So what we know is that folks in the LGBTQ community do not feel the police are their friends, right? And so we have the problem, not only are we on the receiving end of random folks in our community's bad behavior, but then the very folks whose job it is to protect us, help us, serve us when that happens, we also can't trust, right? This is a study, a little old, but 7 years, not that bad. I don't know that the percentages have changed dramatically in the last couple of years, unless COVID's made everyone even less trusting. Right? And we have all these historical things that are, in our memories. For some of us, like me, I'm old, right? I'm 60. I actually remember all this stuff. I remember homosexual sex being illegal. I remember our relationships not being recognized legally in any form. I remember cops in Chicago picking on gay-owned businesses specifically for things that had nothing to do with being gay, but just because they wanted to, right? I remember when being gay, not just gay and trans both were considered pathologies, right? And you get diagnoses for them, and when it was considered appropriate to try to fix that, long before we even considered outlawing those therapies or anything else. So all of this is in our collective memory, and for some of us in our individual memory, and affects our ability to feel safe, right? And to ask for help from those systems that are meant to. And to be really clear, right? A queer person who looks like me has a lot less of that issue than a lot of other folks that look different. Because I get all the privilege of appearing white and male and a whole bunch of other things that make those folks in those systems treat me relatively well, unless I specifically tell them who I am, right? Where for a lot of folks that is not. And so it's much worse for people. I'm talking about it, but I want to acknowledge that it really varies depending on what people can see or what they think they can see from the outside. Transgender folks, right? 50% of trans folks said they were afraid to ask for assistance from law enforcement. This is a study for the National Center for Transgender Equality. 22%. Again, there's the whole citation is supposed to be at the bottom, but for some reason it's not displaying it. 22% of those who engaged with law enforcement reported harassment based on their gender identity or expression. And 6% actually reported bias-motivated assault, physical assault by cops. So why would we trust? So last thing I want to say, and then I'll take a few more questions before we run out of time, is despite all those good reasons not to trust, I think we have some good reasons to trust, at least in the intention to change from our state. Right? Not saying it's perfect by any means, but I think there really is a desire to do this better. We are ahead of so many states and so many territories. We've been collecting sexual orientation data on both the youth and adult health surveys in the state for multiple years. As of 2021, we are now collecting gender identity data on both surveys consistently as well, and have the slides with the data that I presented a few minutes ago came from that, right? So we're gathering some data. Some places really are just beginning to get there or are still fighting it. We had a memorial that was introduced to the state legislature in 2015 that led to a public-private task force on LGBTQ health. The state put a lot of time, energy, money into working with us to really look at what was happening to queer folks' health in the state at a time when we were under Susana Martinez, right? So even when we don't have a very supportive administration, we've been able to keep that work going in the state, which I think is important to acknowledge. And the Department of Health published a report based on that work in June of 2018, still under Governor Martinez. Since that time, various programs at the state have been working on equity, increasing equity for our communities. And then in 2019 and 2021, There were bills introduced to the legislature to collect SOGI data, like sexual orientation and gender identity data, on a much broader level, not just these two health surveys, but all the different programs run by the state. And the idea is, and we're going to hear more about that in a few minutes, but the goal of that is the more we understand what's happening and where there are problems, the more we can respond to them. If we don't gather the data, then we know there's problems, but how do we know what to do, right? And after that, each of those bills almost passed and didn't for procedural reasons than anything. And as a result, on August 16th of 2021, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham issued an executive order calling for the same data collection that was in those bills that didn't get passed. Right. So for a year now, just over a year, the state government here has been working on how to implement asking those questions in appropriate ways in lots of different places. Any minute now, state employees will have a module in their the software that they use with the state, their employment software, where they'll be able to self-identify for sexual orientation, gender identity. They'll be able to put their pronouns, things of that sort, right? So this is a huge movement forward. And I'm excited to say that they actually let us talk to them about how to do that. They didn't just take the canned module on SOGI that came from their provider. Justin, who was going to present with me in a few minutes about SOGI, and I got to actually talk to them and make suggestions about how to do this in a way that was appropriate for the community. We're also going to see on things as large as registration for Medicaid questions about this too, which will mean that we will then be able to track where our folks are showing up in the system, where they're having problems. So the state's done a lot. And the last thing is that when they created the 988 system here, I didn't go and say, by the way, you should hire me to teach you about queer folks. They were looking for someone, and someone told them that we were already doing this work in other programs, and they approached me and said, would you please develop training for this? Would you please work with us? We really want to get this right. So again, it doesn't mean they'll always get it right. It doesn't mean I always get it right, and I'm in the community myself, right? But I think it does show an interest. And so I think we can be hopeful. This is the report that was published in 2018 by the Department of Health. And I will now take a couple more questions. And Justin, you're up next. There was a question over here. Yeah, that I didn't take before.
This is a really good jumping off point to talk about trust in the police. So just for New Mexico specifically, what sort of state in that little flow chart are we at? And what are the best practices for people calling in, like someone like myself who's brown, 6'4", and scary looking? What is our best opportunity to avoid having the cops show up? Because that's my biggest fear. And on these services is that my rate of survival is not really good if it gets to that point. And so where are the lines of mandatory reporting on that?
Okay, so if what you're calling for is like you want to talk to someone about what's going on, you're having a rough moment, and you think you want a conversation, I think you're probably pretty safe. There's no reason if you call and say, I'm struggling right now with any of the things that this line is designed to deal with, substance or otherwise. There's no reason that they would do anything other than talk to you on the phone. I think if you were serious, in a situation where you thought that there was a need for someone to come physically, to be, to do something, either because you need physical help to get out of the situation, or if you feel at risk physically in the situation, that's where it gets a little less clear because the emergency response teams don't exist yet. So who are they going to send? But I think, I think that calling to ask for a conversation, calling to ask for resources, like what do they know about you're looking for X, Y, or Z kind of service? Can they tell you what's available in your area? Or I think that stuff, you're good. And they're not going to know that you're 6'4", or how brown you are, or how scary you are. Right? So I think you're safe. But I absolutely agree that because those specialists who are going to be the response team for the 988 are not in place in most of the state yet, I wouldn't rush to necessarily request that someone come out physically if you're not ready to do it, or if you don't really need it.
So we have a couple of questions from our online folks joining us. Newt asks, so the same SI-HI disclosure rules apply? Like an individual therapist, if you are in danger of self-harm or harming others, that's what sets off possible police and normal first responder response, question mark? So essentially asking, what is the rules around mandatory reporting?
So the deal is, if they really think that imminent harm to someone, not eventual harm, but imminent harm, meaning like right now you're jumping off the roof, or right now someone attacking someone else, then yes, they would try to respond.
We have one more question by Lee. That's question is, let's say a 14-year-old trans teenager calls 988 from a rural New Mexico town and states they are depressed and desperate to transition, but they are not safe at home with emotionally abusive and transphobic caregivers. The kid has no access to money or transportation and is not fully literate. The kid does not have a healthcare provider. How would 988 respond to this?
I think that while it's a great question, it's one I'm probably going to not answer because, one, I don't actually work for 988, but two, I don't think there is an answer to that question. I think it would depend a whole lot on the person that got that call. And I don't want to, they're not automatons, right? They're not all the same. So I think what they would do for sure is listen to the kid, try to understand the situation as best they can. They do have a lot of resources available to them, or information about resources, and they would try to strategize what might be available. If the individual person who took the call really didn't know and there was somebody better, they might forward that call to someone with more specific information, right? But realistically, 988 is not a magic wand. It's not going to come in and change the whole world for us or for any individual. So I think it would be the same. They would do the same what they're set up to do, which is listen, ask questions, be supportive, provide ideas that the kid might be able to use, help them strategize, maybe give them some online resources that they can access from where they are without their parents knowing, right? Those kinds of things. But they're not in a position to take the kid legally out of his parents' house or anything for their parents' house. I don't know the gender of this trans kid. They may have said, but I forgot. So it's not gonna solve that problem, but it might help with resources.
One last question.
Okay.
What is the plan for creating the crisis response teams in other areas of the state?
So the Behavioral Health Services Division of the state of New Mexico has an open RF request for proposals on that area. The money is already set aside and available to be spent. And they're reaching out to folks in certain areas for sure, but also continuing to just publicize that this is available and trying to interest organizations in different places. And it can be places that already are doing some piece of this, right? The vision is that most of the contractors will probably be doing some sort of mental health or behavioral health work already. And they might add this to the services they already have. But yeah, at this point where they are is just sort of, they've set aside the funds, they've publicized it, they've set out the criteria and the application process. And they are continuing to reach out, in particularly in areas where there's great need, right? And trying to build it out. But at this point, what we know is Rio Rancho got a federal grant, so they're starting their system. Doña Ana County is already putting their system into place, and it's actually being run by the county. Grant County has a funded program. Carlsbad has a funded program. Several tribal communities have created their own programs that are in the process of being built out as well. So it's sort of piecemeal at this point, because I think the vision was we want folks to do this because they really want to do it. We want the folks to do it that are committed and they're going to stay and keep doing this for a while. We don't want to spend a bunch of money to support someone to create a program that they then drop in 2 years, right? Which happens a lot if you kind of if you push people into stuff. So yeah, so it's open and happening, but it's a bit random at this point.
I just wanted to
I just wanted to say for the example of a 14-year-old, I recommend calling the Trans Lifeline, which also provides wraparound services for any trans and non-binary identified folks who may also be questioning. And you will always talk to a trans provider, and they let you identify whatever your crisis means to you. And then also I wanted to ask, how is this different from the Albuquerque Community Safety Department that was developed in 2020? And or do they like work together?
So I can't answer that last question because I actually don't know enough about Albuquerque programs. We also don't weigh in. But yeah, and resources like the Trans Lifeline and Trevor Project and all kinds of other things are in the list of resources that the 988 folks have. So it's not that's one of the places they might, that they might recommend as well if someone didn't know how to find them directly, but called 988. Right? We've given them long lists of resources, including the groups and organizations here in the state as well as the national. So thank you. So let's end there. I'm happy to take other questions from folks at another time. Let's get Justin a microphone, and we're going to move on to talking about SOGI data gathering at New Mexico State Government. Thank you, Justin, for joining. And thanks for all your questions.